Welcome. I'm John Bagnulo. I'm really excited to be with you this afternoon to discuss the importance and clinical relevance of our patients' omega-3 to omega-6 ratios. I'm going to say here in advance of today's discussion that there's two different ways to look at this. We could look at this as an omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, or of course, an omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. Often you're going to see it discussed or described in both ways. So, with that being said, again excited to be with you, and also excited to have Laura Dority with us, who is our national director of clinical clinical advisement here. Both Laura and I serve for nutritional medicinals. I'm the director of nutrition, and again, Laura is a national clinical manager advisor for the company. So, I want to make sure we're clear about that. I also want to be really clear with the learning objectives that we have for you today. The first is to really understand and identify a more biological appropriate or physiologically compatible omega-6 to omega-3 ratio that is supported by a combination of things, human genetics, of course, as well as anthropological data that we'll discuss in a moment. Next, I think it's very important with respect to applying this information to our patients and their health is really list those food sources of omega-3 fatty acids, that are missing for a lot of our patients' diets. They're less common now. And also identify and list, those sources of omega-6 fatty acids that are sort of new to the human diet, but have created a significant imbalance or increased ratio of 6:3, omega-6 to omega-3. It's very important after today's talk to be able to explain how each of these essential fatty acids, omega-6s and omega-3s, how they influence what we call the eicosanoid pathways, which we'll get to in a moment, and also understand and to be able to describe that the changes that take place in cell membrane stability or resistance to lipid peroxidization and free radical formation when these polyunsaturated fatty acids become a predominant component of a phospholipid bilayer or a cell membrane. So those are the learning objectives. Now, I won't beleaguer this here, but I think it's also important to understand that we're talking about a polyunsaturated group of polyunsaturated fatty acids. So, monounsaturated fats are predominantly in the form of oleic acid, which you see here. That's called an omega-9 fatty acid because that one double bond occurs after the 9th carbon in that fatty acid. Linoleic, which is the predominant source of omega-6 fats that we're talking about today, it's polyunsaturated. It has 2 double bonds, and that first double bond occurs after the 6th carbon. In the case of alpha-linolenic acid, which is the plant-based version of omega-3 fatty acids, that first double bond, it has 3 double bonds, and that first one occurs after the 3rd carbon. So that's where the nomenclature comes into play. Then we have some less common omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids. You see the gamma-linolenic, which is 3 double bonds, but again, the first one happening after the 6th carbon, and then stearidonic acid, which is an omega-3 fat. It's more of a hybrid. It's not really considered one of your highly unsaturated fatty acids. Those are your DHA and EPA, which we'll talk about in a little while. But it's an omega-3 because the first double bond occurs after that 3rd carbon. It has 4 double bonds, so it's on its way. It's becoming desaturated. And this is what I say hybrid. It's an intermediate omega-3 fatty acid that is a step of elongation from alpha-linolenic, which is the middle one here, on its way being converted by the body or by a mammal to either docahexanoic acid or eicosapentaenoic acid, which are DHA and EPA. So just this is the background here. It's really important to have some of this nutritional biochemistry to better understand what we're describing when we say an omega-6 versus an omega-3, a polyunsaturated versus a monounsaturated fat. I think this can really help us, better understand what we're describing. Now, as predominant sources of specific fatty acids, the saturated fats you'll see at the top here, predominantly coming from things like, coconut or palm oil, and obviously dairy, meat, and then certain nuts. Your monounsaturated fats, just again, having that one double bond, most often after the 9th carbon. That's why it's an omega-9 if you want to get technical. Those are found in things like olives, olive oil, almonds, obviously avocados and macadamia nuts as big sources of those. Now, when we get into these polyunsaturated fats, which is really our focus this afternoon, you have two major groups of polyunsaturated fats. You have the omega-6s that are coming from plants, which you see listed there. Predominantly, in today's diet, for the average, let's say, North American, most of those omega-6 fatty acids are going to come from some type of vegetable or industrial seed oil, or they're going to come from nuts and seeds. Those are your leading sources. Again, about 13% of the omega-6 fats in the average American's body, those are in the form of arachidonic acid coming from chicken. Poultry is a really rich source of omega-6 fats and of arachidonic acid because, of course, almost all chickens that are raised for human consumption are fed an abundance of grains and legumes and some of the byproducts from those plants, which are very rich in omega-6 fatty acids. And then, of course, the chicken's physiology converts those linoleic acid from things like soybean meal and corn meal. Those are converted into arachidonic acid, which is a longer chained omega-6 fatty acid, which is used in the inflammatory cascade. We'll get to that in a moment. The omega-3 fatty acids are coming either from plants like flax seeds, maybe from certain herbs like purslane, or they're coming from, again, predominantly now with the typical North American diet, they're coming from some type of oily fish, and to a lesser extent from things like eggs, grass-fed beef, or other meats. So those are just some of the most common sources of these from both plants and animals. Now, things have changed a lot, even since 1970, which is where, the USDA started to use some data and started to compile what we call NHANES data, which I talk about usually in most of these webinars and in talks that I give. NHANES data is, in some cases, the best information that we have with respect to what people are eating, what micronutrients or macronutrients are, let's just say, less common or deficient in a population's diet. And we know that if we go back to 1970, there have been two major increases with respect to the average American diet. Number one is we've seen almost a 50% increase in the consumption of grain, cereal, and flour-based products. And number two, there's been around a 30 to 40% increase in the consumption of oils, and in specific oils. So I think this is a really good time for me just to stop and pay, I think, great respect to one of the foremost experts in the area of ancestral nutrition, changes that have occurred over the last several thousand to several decades. And, those are highlighted in what I consider to be one of the top 5 clinical papers ever published in the field of nutrition. And I don't make that statement. I don't, make that lightly. I really have just an incredible amount of respect and appreciation for the work of Lauren Cordain and the other authors that, wrote this amazing paper, which is Origins and Evolution of the Western Diet, Health Implications for the 21st Century. It's a 2005, as you can see here, American Journal of Clinical Nutrition paper. It was February of that year. And just to give you 5 highlights of that paper, one of which is very relevant to today's talk, that there's 3 major changes responsible for most chronic disease now. If we take a look at an ancestral human diet and that which is we consider now the Western diet. And the big ones are a displacement of whole plants, mostly vegetables, herbaceous plants, to a lesser extent fruit, and wild foods, including wild game, with grains, sugar, and vegetable oils. And the authors go on to show with great detail how these are, in the case of grains, sugar, and vegetable oils, they're basically new foods to human physiology. I say physiology and not genetics because we have to take into account things like the microbiome, which are very, again, influenced by genetics, but have been incredibly challenged by these new additions And then we have vegetable and industrial seed oils as, one of these new to, kind of new to the human diet additions, and how those are ultimately responsible for now this massive omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, which historically over the, again, going back into Paleolithic and earlier times, were never greater than 2 to 1 based on a wide variety of anthropological data. So that's a huge discord between that 2 to 1 ancestral ratio and now, which on a conservative basis would be 20 to 1, and others would argue 30 to 1, omega-6 to omega-3. And that this modern imbalance results in, this dominant, arachidonic acid dominant inflammatory pathway. So I just want to highlight that paper because it is so important. And then if we kind of come back to more contemporary changes, again, the Pew Research Center has spent, considerable amount of time and resources on trying to track some of these changes. And if we go back to 1970 and take a look at some specific foods, you can see that chicken has risen significantly, cooking oils significantly, and those are predominantly omega-6 rich foods. So that's, in a nutshell, that's what we're covering here today. Is we've got this marked rise or increase in omega-6s, both from animal foods, predominantly chicken, but also from feedlot raised beef, which is fed, again, mostly grains in the way of soybean meal, corn meal, and those are going to be omega-6 dominant. And all of that bioaccumulates into the tissues of those animals. But make no mistake about it, fried foods and the use of sunflower oil, corn oil, safflower oil, all of these omega-6 dominant polyunsaturated rich oils, which are very inexpensive, and that's why they're used so heavily by the food industry, used in a wide variety of applications. Those have displaced more traditional oils and fats. Whether we look at olive oil or butter or coconut oil, those are much more, even though olive oil is still omega-6 dominant, it's much more balanced, let's say, than a safflower or a sunflower oil. So, the USDA can show this in a lot of different fashions, but you can see here that added fats and oils have gone up from around 337 calories per day for the average American to, 562. That's conservative compared to what we have from National Geographic, which the statistics department show that in 1961, the average American got around 276 calories, now well over 600, almost to 700 calories per day. Again, a lot of it is used in processed foods, things with long shelf lives, fried food, of course. So it's coming at us in a lot of different ways. But ultimately, these oils have most of their fatty acid content tied up in the way of omega-6s. And so, again, that 30 to 1 ratio, which a lot of researchers say is very common for North Americans eating a typical Western diet, that is going to set that individual or this population up by and large for more inflammation and to be prone to inflammatory conditions. So it's not until you get down around flaxseed that you see it's an omega-3 dominant oil, and that's very rare. Flaxseed oil, of course, it has a short shelf life. It has to be, handled very carefully. Again, when it's used in foods, you have to make sure there's nothing present in those foods in the way of other ingredients that's going to promote oxidation. And it's much more expensive. It's the most expensive that you're going to see on this list of oils. So, with that being said, we know where we're at in terms of the levels of consumption of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids, and we've never, ever been at this place before over the course of the human diet. Physiologically, where we are in terms of what tissue samples show, but it's just a massive, massive omega-6 dominant consumption pattern that we're on, from the way of vegetable oils, the increased poultry products, the way poultry and pork is being raised now, but again, predominantly grain-fed. And when we start looking at those tissue samples that I mentioned, looking at linoleic acid, again, when you see the word linoleic, keep in mind that's the plant-based omega-6 fatty acid. If we look at the levels of linoleic acid that are found in United States citizen body fat samples, biopsies from 1961 to 2008, you can see you have an unbelievable slope to this line, going from somewhere around 8% to now in excess of 20%. And now there's really, just with a basic understanding of human physiology, there's a price to pay for that. And first and foremost, as I've mentioned, it's inflammation. So how does this change our risk for cardiovascular disease? Now, why is it we're going to focus on cardiovascular disease? Well, for the most part, it's because, you know, coronary heart disease, cardiovascular disease, those have always been the #1 killer when it comes to chronic disease here in the United States, and now, you know, for the most part, worldwide. And what you see is that as those levels of omega-6 fatty acids, and in this case, we're looking at highly unsaturated fatty acids. That's what HUFA stands for. When you see that those now tissue levels have risen to where they are, you can see that the mortality rate, it's got a Pearson's correlation coefficient of almost 1.0, which means that the two variables are tied closely together, almost inseparable. And you can see that in some areas where there's higher levels of omega-3s and less omega-6s, for instance, in Greenland, in an older Japanese population, you have much, much lower levels of coronary heart disease, and of course, very, very low levels of these omega-6 fatty acids because they're just not present in those populations' diets. Those are very omega-3 dominant diets. And, you know, cardiologists like Jim O'Keefe, who I have great respect for, you know, they've for years now have said there is a strong body of evidence that supports omega-6 vegetable oils as a primary driving force of coronary heart disease because of how easily oxidized they are, and how that oxidized omega-6 fatty acid is a precursor to all of the different changes, biochemical changes that take place with respect to coronary plaque. Phenomenal paper. I highly recommend this paper if this is an area of cardiology that you're interested in. Now, okay, so when we look at the inverse is true with coronary heart disease and omega-3 fatty acid content. So here we see the exact opposite slope. It isn't quite as steep, but it is an inverse relationship where the higher levels of omega-3s found in tissue samples correlates with very low levels of coronary heart disease. So just another way of looking at that omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, and both are true. Now, more recent or contemporary studies that have looked at the relationship of different dietary fats to disease and mortality overall shows that with saturated and monounsaturated fat, you see there's a decreased hazard ratio with an increased consumption of monounsaturated fat. In fact, it never really bottoms out. You can see that even when monounsaturated fat is becoming more than 25% of a population's diet, in excess of 25%, and it continues on from here, that there's a continual decrease in the hazard ratio of all-cause mortality. The same is also true, interestingly enough, for saturated fat. And this paper, this is the PURE study, of course, which is a phenomenal paper looking at the relationship of dietary fat to all-cause mortality, and then some different sources or causes of mortality, really breaking down different types of fatty acids and their relationship. And it's a 2017 paper published in the Lancet, looking at, you're just talking about 50,000 plus participants in the study. So over 50,000 participants, well over that, 18 different countries, 5 different continents. And what was shown is that for saturated fat and monounsaturated fat, that there's a decreased hazard ratio for increasing your levels of consumption of both of those types of fats, which really vindicated saturated fat for many. It really was kind of the proof that I think people were looking for with respect to the safety and efficacy of consuming more coconut oil and things like that. But with polyunsaturated fat, there is a slight uptick in that hazard ratio once polyunsaturated fats start to become more than around 7 to 8% of the diet. So I think this is a really important part, is that there is even although we're talking about omega-6s and omega-3s, when we look at polyunsaturated fats collectively, there's a sweet spot here for the amount we want to contain physiologically in our cell membranes. And that is understanding the mechanism behind, let's just say, higher levels of coronary heart disease, all-cause mortality. How is it that these omega-6s and an omega-6 dominant diet, one that starts to provide too much of these easily oxidized, highly polyunsaturated fats to our physiology? How is it they could undermine our health and lead to a higher risk for certain chronic diseases or an inflammatory condition overall? Well, number one is that these polyunsaturated fatty acids, with respect to both omega-6s and omega-3s, they have a huge influence on that phospholipid bilayer that I mentioned earlier. That's the cell membrane. It's going to be a function of each fatty acid's chemical structure, resistance to oxidation, ability to flex, and to accommodate changes in the protein channels that lie within those cell membranes. There are these protein channels that allow substances into a cell, waste products and other molecules out of a cell, and those protein channels have to have the ability to have at least a modest change in their structure, what we call conformational changes, and the polyunsaturated fats, the monounsaturated fats, and the levels of saturated fats that we have in this membrane or this phospholipid bilayer, they ultimately control how these protein channels move and can change their structure slightly if necessary. And if the cell membrane isn't comprised of the right mix of these fatty acids, then that system starts to break down. So that's a big part of this, and that's often referred to as a lipid raft model. And the other major mechanism that we need to discuss here is these eicosanoids that can be either pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory, that can promote clot formation or give us some resistance to clot formation, i.e. keeping the blood a little thinner. All of these mechanisms are behind the critical nature of a polyunsaturated fatty acid balance, both with respect to total amount in our diet, as well as with respect to the omega-6 and omega-3 ratio or balance. This is the best illustration I can provide for that lipid raft theory. Look at the phospholipid bilayer here at the central of this. You can see there's a protein channel there in the center, represented by those two straight lines with darkened terminal ends. You can see that the fatty acids that are around those are going to have influence on how that protein channel, how the shape and nature of transportation across that protein channel, how that's influenced. You know, and the health implications of this reaches into neurology, right, with respect to Alzheimer's and neurodegenerative diseases, obviously cardiology. But the way we construct these phospholipid bilayers, again, we're going to ultimately be the sum of all the cells in our body. It has an enormous influence on our health. And this is the eicosanoid pathway that I was describing. You can see that on the left here, you see prostacyclines, thromboxanes. You're also going to have prostaglandins and leukotrienes, which are not here on this. They are at the top, but they're not down here. It's part of the cascade. Those have a huge influence on things like blood vessel dilation, platelet aggregation, as I mentioned, or clot formation and inflammation. And the ones on the left of the series 2 variety, those eicosanoids tend to favor clot formation and more inflammation. The ones that you see on the right here that are generated from eicosapentaenoic acid, which is a fully formed omega-3 fatty acid, those are anti-inflammatory. Those reduce platelet aggregation and really promote increased vasodilation. So this is a really good illustration that reflects that eicosanoid pathway. Now, again, the omega-6 fatty acids and the omega-3 fatty acids have to be fully elongated, and they have to be further desaturated to get into, in the case of an omega-6 fatty acid, what we call arachidonic acid. In the way of omega-3s, they have to become ultimately DHA or EPA. And that's, at that point, is when they will start to form these series 2 or series 3, series 1 and 3 type eicosanoids. But it's the series 2 that are pro-inflammatory. It's the odd number series 1 and 3 that have at least some anti-inflammatory properties. But omega-6s are going to end up becoming series 2 eicosanoids. That's their connection to inflammation. And again, you know, they're essential. You have to have some omega-6 fatty acids in the diet. Our patients need to have some of these so that they can fight infection, so that they can produce inflammation when it's important to the human body. But if we have an overabundance of omega-6 fatty acids available in a patient's cellular physiology, then they have the potential to produce too much inflammation all the time. And that's really what really starts to impair recovery and really takes its toll on overall patient health, and certainly is not in line with the improved outcomes that we're looking for. So, I think that's just an important kind of high level 30,000 foot take here on the importance of balance. You have to have some omega-6 fatty acids in the diet, but you don't want them to be overrepresented. You really want them to be in close concert or balance to the omega-3s. Otherwise, everything starts to go in that pro-inflammatory direction. And this is a paper from 2020, which is a really good one looking at brain health and omega-6 fatty acids. And I'd say this is the neurology version of the Jim O'Keefe paper that I mentioned earlier with respect to omega-6 vegetable oils driving heart disease. This is a paper that really shows all the pro-inflammatory mediators that appear in the human brain after a serving of omega-6 rich vegetable oil. And you can see that, again, you've got these thromboxanes, that's the TXA2, you got leukotrienes, LT4, all these pro-inflammatory mediators that are appearing after these omega-6 rich meals that we know take their toll on brain health. So that's a wonderful paper if you're in the area of neurology and want to know more about this relationship. Some other papers are a little older, but I think they have great value. This is a preventive medicine paper, Harris and Shackey, which looks at the role of the omega-3 index, which is simply the levels of omega-3s to omega-6s. And you can see that the highest risk for sudden cardiac death by risk factor is, in fact, for a very, very high level of omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. And you see that here at the far right. In fact, it's actually it's a stronger relationship than you get for C-reactive protein, which is at the far left. These make things like triglycerides and LDL levels, and they make them look insignificant because of the drop-off that you get in relative risk for sudden cardiac death when you start to move towards a lower level of C-reactive protein, again on the left, or a higher level of omega-3 to omega-6 content in red blood cell membrane, when you see that here on the far right. So it really puts this, I think, into a much clearer picture for what we're talking about. Same thing has been shown here by Pichon and Harkinson in the journal Circulation. Now, this is 19 years old, but you can see that the highest risk for elevated levels of inflammatory markers, they looked at everything, C-reactive protein. This one looks at tumor necrosis factor, but highest levels are when you have highest risk levels and highest levels of observed tumor necrosis factor when you are at the very low levels of EPA and DHA and very high levels of linoleic acid or omega-6. So just different ways to look at it, but there is definitely a sweet spot, as I mentioned, right? There's going to be that place where, more is not better, and that has clearly been shown with the intake of marine omega-3s. So these are going to be in the way of DHA or EPA. We're not talking about flaxseed oil here or alpha-linolenic acid. We're talking about marine oil like fish oil, where you can see where you start to get beyond somewhere around 0.75 grams per day. There starts to appear to be a slight increase for risk of atrial fibrillation, irregular heartbeat. And this is, this is getting kind of into the weeds a little bit here, but I think it always begs the question, what is the optimal physiological level for some of these? And when we don't have all the answers, we know that more is not always better. Now, there's a much, much higher level of ceiling of biological compatibility with flaxseed oil, which is, again, is alpha-linolenic acid, because the body has to make DHA or EPA from that alpha-linolenic acid, and there's somewhat of a protective bottleneck there where we're not going to produce too much of the DHA or EPA for the human body from those. So that may explain why we see this relationship for fish oil, but we really don't see it the same way for things like flaxseed oil and plant sources of omega-3s. The other part to consider, again, as I've mentioned, is how easily peroxidized, which just refers to the formation of lipid peroxides. The highly polyunsaturated fatty acids, because they have more than one double bond, are always going to be the most susceptible to the formation of lipid peroxides and oxidation overall. And we're trying to avoid that. Oxidation is a mechanism that generally destroys functional components of our cells, makes them less viable. It's a big part of the aging process. So we're trying to become as much resistant to oxidation as we can. And that's where, minimizing our physiological levels of some of these highly polyunsaturated fatty acids is an advantage. So we need omega-6s. We just need them in smaller quantities than the average North American is consuming. We need omega-3s. We want to get those in close concert to the amount of omega-6s in our diet, or have maybe slightly more if we're trying to reduce inflammation or improve an outcome that is related to inflammation. But even with omega-3s, it's clear that in the case of fish oil, more is not always better, that there's that sweet spot there with respect to what's optimal. So that's what we often refer to as the Paracelsus principle of a nutrient. Now, I want to leave you, before I turn it over to Laura and look at some clinical recommendations, I think it's important that we look at, especially for children first, who are in a stage of development. It's probably optimal if a child is in good health, meaning they're not dealing with any type of chronic condition, they're not critically ill, to start somewhere in the area of a 3-to-1 to 2-to-1 ratio for children. For adults, it should be 2-to-1 or less. Now, with more inflammation present, or a critically ill patient, one who has compromised health in one way or another, that's where a higher level of omega-3 fatty acids, which will produce a lower omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, is probably beneficial to that patient, because we know that lower omega-6 to omega-3 ratios are associated with less inflammation. And so that's why we're trying to turn those ratios around. But for a healthy population, 3-to-1, even 2-to-1 for kids, it's a good healthy ratio. For adults, 2-to-1 to 1-to-1 are probably optimal. And then there's ways that we can assess this in a patient or in the populations that we deal with. One, obviously, high levels of inflammation, such as an elevated C-reactive protein, should always make us consider this, something to address with a patient. And now there are these, easily ordered red blood cell membrane tests, often referred to as a omega test, omega-3 index test, and they're offered by labs like Quest. And that way you'll, with a red blood cell membrane, you're going to get at least the last 90 days of what a patient has eaten, because that's how long those blood cells last in circulation. So you're going to get a long-term picture of fatty acid intake and assimilation into a patient's body. So I really like that omega index test when it's necessary and could be beneficial to help them understand what's going on with the patient. And with that, I am excited to turn it over to Laura here. Laura?
Great. Thank you, Dr. Bagnulo. So I just want to take about 5-10 minutes here to talk about some clinical recommendations that Dr. Bagnulo and I have put together. And then we will open it up to questions. And it looks like we're going to have a lot of time for questions. So that's always a good thing, because we're always running out of time on these webinars. So first, the first clinical recommendation we put together was making saturated and or monounsaturated fats the foundation of fatty acid composition and the leading sources of calories. The second, and I'm going to go into more details about each of these, but the second one, in kind of going off the first one, is using saturated and monounsaturated fats as your predominant cooking oils, since they generally have the higher smoke points and are going to be less susceptible to that oxidation that Dr. Bagnulo discussed. Third, focusing and trying to consume at least 1,000 milligrams of omega-3 fatty acids daily, depending if it's ALA or DHA EPA, more may be ideal, but really starting with a realistic goal of 1,000 milligrams. And then lastly, trying to limit the use of those omega-6 dominant seed oils that are really the primary reason for the imbalance we see today in today's eating patterns. So let's first look at some fat sources and how those fat sources are broken down into the percentage of saturated, poly, and monounsaturated. I think it's important to point out that none of these fat sources are purely just one type of fat. they are all mixed to some degree. So even if you're focused on primarily mono and saturated fats, you're still going to get some polyunsaturated fats in your diet by default. And Dr. Bagnulo talked about, we need omega-6s, we need all these different fat sources to some extent. So simply by just focusing on mono and saturated fats, you're by default going to get some poly. While of course, this chart is not all inclusive to every fat source available, but I do feel like it's an easy visual that you can use with patients and families that help them identify that, olive oil, for example, is primarily monounsaturated fat, and soybean oil is primarily omega-6 in the form of the linoleic acid. So if we are focusing on more saturated mono fats, looking at this, the yellow and reds, is an easy visual, and then comparing it to the amount of blue, which represents the omega-6 quantity, can be really helpful. Just as a reference, this chart is available pretty readily online. Most of you have probably seen it at some point. It's from the Canadian Nutrient File and the USDA National Nutrient Database, if you're looking for it. One of my favorite monounsaturated fat sources is avocados. I honestly think, as a dietitian, this is one of the most versatile and healthy foods that Mother Nature has provided us. Not only is it a great source of fat, it's also loaded with the fiber, potassium, magnesium, the list could go on and on. But these are all nutrients that most people are lacking. So today we've provided everybody in attendance with a patient education handout. This on the screen is just a snippet of the front page seen here. But in the handout section of the webinar, you can get the full document. The back page is more easy tips on how to incorporate avocados into a daily routine. It has some recipes on the back as well, and it's completely non-branded. We will also send out this handout that you can use with patients when we send out the continuing education certificate and the references. Let's talk just briefly about smoke points. I know when, many years ago when I was in school, we didn't really focus on this a whole lot, and I've learned a lot over the years about smoke points and which type of fats I should be cooking with and which ones are more appropriate for salad dressings or more cold situations. So as we take a look at this infographic, it breaks down fats by their smoke points. So, high heat oils, which are defined by temperatures above 450 degrees Fahrenheit, are great for all-purpose cooking. So if we're focusing on monounsaturated fats, avocado oil would be a great option from this section, as well as like the clarified butter. Moving down the list, the medium high heat oils are great for baking and sauteing, and looking at olive oil from this list as a focus point. And medium heat oils, so the next section down, you've got your extra virgin olive oil, coconut oil, and butter as monounsaturated choices as well. When it comes to omega-3 consumption goals, I think it's important to point out, Dr. Bagnulo and I are recommending 1,000 milligrams a day, and there is an adequate intake for omega-3s that has been established. But the adequate intakes for omega-3s are based on ALA only. So the adequate intake for males is 1,600 milligrams a day and 1,100 milligrams a day for women, of course, more with pregnancy and lactation. But the reason the AI is only based on ALA is that by definition, that is the only omega-3 that is essential. And the Institute of Medicine has not established specific intakes for EPA and DHA. So that's just something to consider when we're talking about the DRIs and recommendations and so forth. Now, as we mentioned earlier, ALA to some small degree can convert into DHA and EPA, but that seems to be, that consumption level or that transition level varies by person to person, and it allows a protective effect. Dr. John had that one really nice slide, a protective effect from your omega-3 from EPA and DHA going too high. But I think when you're setting omega-3 goals for clients and patients, it's important to keep in mind the baseline of what they're eating. Saying, hey, get 1,000 milligrams of omega-3 to someone who is eating 10 milligrams of omega-3, maybe a lot. So baby stepping it up into small amounts to achieve that goal is ideal. And this chart is from the NIH and outlines some of the best sources of omega-3s. Of course, not the only sources, just the most common. So I'm going to talk about, flax seeds, chia seeds, walnuts, and salmon as really being the most robust, biggest bang for your buck sort of concept of getting your omega-3s in. On the next slide. So, a lot of people think that if you don't like fatty fish or you don't have access to fatty fish, depending on where you live, you have to get your omega-3s through a supplement. And of course, in some cases, a supplement may be necessary, but in reality, omega-3s are much bigger than just fatty fish. So when educating patients, I think it's important to offer suggestions in terms of the nuts and seeds. And my biggest favorite is walnuts, because 14 halves of a walnut 2,500 milligrams of omega-3. I mean, 14 halves. I'm just gonna pause for dramatic effect here, because that's it, just 14 halves gets you 2,500 milligrams of omega-3. Now, while that's primarily ALA, some of that will again convert over to EPA and DHA, and I think most people can eat 14 halves of walnuts. Other suggestions though, trying to get salmon 2 times a week or maybe 3 times a week, depending if it's wild or farm raised. You can get 1,500 to 1,800 milligrams of omega-3. And then another thing, adding chia and or flax seeds to just about anything and everything. They're really a versatile food as well. Looking at variety is being important, but again, if you have somebody who's not eating any omega-3 rich foods, just focusing on one of these can really provide a very positive impact on that omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. And then finally, limiting the omega-6 sources in people's lives. And I'm a big component of when I'm counseling patients, I want to counsel in a positive way. So, adding omega-3s, that's very positive. Adding more mono and saturated fats, that's very positive. And like, limiting the omega-6 is kind of like as a backup plan. If I focus on adding, people tend to relate to that better than you just starting to take away all the foods that they're currently eating, right? But trying to cut back on the vegetable oil blends, the corn oil, the safflower oil, it's really easy to do if you just say, hey, instead of using this vegetable oil blend, you're converting that over to olive oil, or using avocado oil as another option, flaxseed oil as a cold dressing type of option. That can make a big impact with a very simple change. Most people don't realize that those vegetable oil blends, which is unfortunately still one of the most commonly used oils in America, because it's got a long shelf life, it's inexpensive, it's just merely a blend of several less than ideal oils, the sunflowers, the corn, the soy. At the grocery store, I see these products and they have, some olive oil in it, and they try to promote it, these vegetable oil blends, as a healthy choice, but then when you actually read the label, you realize the olive oil component is the last ingredient, right? So I think that can be a little disheartening and confusing for the consumer base. And then my final point today is, what is the role of the RDN? And honestly, y'all, I think it's just to keep being amazing advocates for healthy, whole food nutrition. I know it's an uphill battle at times, but whether you are in long-term care or inpatient, outpatient, or a community setting, please just keep fighting for the best nutrition for your facility. Keep setting realistic goals for your patients, providing guidance on meal planning, and recommending specific foods to eat. Maybe avocados all day. But just keep fighting. You're doing a great job. I know it's been a rough year in the clinical world of nutrition, but it's we got the rest of the year to build on. And that's all I had. So we have about 15 minutes for question and answer. Dr. Bagnulo and I want to thank you all for your attention. I am going to open this chat screen so I can see all your questions. So give me just a second. And if we, for whatever reason, because I know we're probably going to run out of time because there are a lot of questions here, What we'll try and do is in a few weeks, I am trying to write like a blog to answer some of the questions that Dr. Bagnulo and I don't get to. So we're hoping to get that posted on our website. It's just another medium to try and get your questions answered. But okay, Dr. Bagnulo, are you ready?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, he's always ready. Talk to us a little bit about, so organic chicken versus non-organic chicken doesn't matter in terms of the fat content. How much does it matter? Does grass-fed matter? Talk more about that.
It doesn't matter. Unfortunately, chicken that is being raised, to be at market weight in a relatively reasonable amount of time, it has to be fed grain. There is no chicken or egg for that matter where the chicken is only allowed to eat grass and forage. That would not be a very good business model for anybody in that area of agriculture. The chickens just won't gain weight and they won't get to the size that they need to be, for consumption without the use of grain. And the grains, of course, that are used here in North America and most everywhere now are corn and soybean, because together they make a complete protein, and they do have an abundance of calories that's made available quickly to the chicken. So because of that, both organic and conventional chicken are very high in omega-6 fatty acids.
Okay, thank you. Switching gears here, but give us your thoughts on palm oil, and are there disadvantages of palm oil compared with other saturated fats?
Well, I think palm oil, if it's minimally processed, it should have like a reddish colored hue to it. It does have an antioxidant value that's present there, and it's fairly stable. And it's, again, it's mostly saturated fat. So it's got those attributes that are, I think, good for most people. I think the big downside with palm oil is the ecological impact that it has in terms of palm plantations and the deforestation that occurs, to plant those. So that's really the biggest drawback right now from more of a planetary perspective. But when it comes to the place for palm oil or the type of saturated fat that it contains in human physiology, it's very compatible.
Okay, great. This is a question, I'll answer this one. Where does avocado oil fall on the ratio of omega-6 to 3? Yeah, it wasn't on that chart. So, the avocado oil is high in omega-6 to omega-3, but the thing about avocado oil is it's primarily a monounsaturated fat. So while it has some omega-6 in it, it's a small total quantity of omega-6 because the majority of that fat is going to be monounsaturated. And somebody else asked about, is avocado oil better than avocado or vice versa? And I wouldn't say one's better than the other. I think they provide very different versatility utilizations. I mean, obviously the whole avocado has, the magnesium and the fiber and the potassium. So as a whole food, I personally, as a dietitian, like it better. But I also think, cooking with avocado oil, despite it's expensive, creates a little bit more variety of my cooking oils at home compared to just using olive oil or butter all the time. Back to Dr. Bagnulo. I read that omega-6 to omega-3 ratio is not as reliable of a measure, and we should be looking at the arachidonic acid versus EPA ratio. Can you speak to just kind of how we monitor those omega-3 to omega-6s in general in clinical?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're looking at arachidonic acid levels in comparison to, let's just say, DHA and EPA, yeah, you are looking at, I guess you'd say, the more biologically active components to this discussion. Obviously arachidonic acid is what's used to produce those series 2 eicosanoids that are related or promote inflammation, and the series 1 and 3 from the DHA and EPA, as I discussed earlier, are anti-inflammatory. So you're really kind of getting a more myopic focused look at those, but that would neglect the role that the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio on a macro level has on things like that lipid raft model, the structure of the cell membrane, phospholipid bilayer, however we want to describe that, that's very relevant. So I completely understand the look at arachidonic acid more closely, because that is getting into the inflammatory component of this topic. But there are other components that I think are very important to acknowledge. And again, lipid peroxidization, or the oxidation of different cellular components, whether that's the mitochondrial membrane, the cell membrane, those are going to be closely tied to the levels of omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids that are present in those cell membranes. So that's why I think it's important to look at everything.
Okay, perfect. What are your thoughts on a lot of these products that have market that are like vegan butters, or some of those not dairy-based butters? What are your how are those processed? How do you feel like those fit or don't fit into our diets?
Well, I think some of them are okay. I think if you took an extra virgin olive oil and you blended it with, let's just say, a coconut oil, and had something that was more of a butter type texture, at least when it was refrigerated, I think that's a win-win. But the ones that use other ingredients, some of which are not that, just really not that compatible with our physiology. There's some that use different types of gums, stabilizers. I mean, I think it really depends on the ingredients that are involved. But, I think for our listeners that want to have something that's more spreadable, if you put extra virgin olive oil in the refrigerator or in the freezer, you're going to end up with a solid that, if you take it out of the freezer, for a short period of time, it doesn't take long for that to reach that margarine or butter-like texture. I think there's ways to do this without having to buy something that's heavily processed and would contain ingredients or types of oils you don't want. So I'd probably say that first, but there are some out there that are okay.
Okay. Tell us about, so does roasting walnuts, for example, or smoking salmon, how does that impact the omega-3 levels of those foods?
It destroys them. It's really simple. Yeah, those temperatures you showed, the smoke points for different oils, those certainly hold true, or more so for the types of really, really delicate fats we're talking about in salmon. That's a highly polyunsaturated, elongated, or what we call a PUFA. Those are extremely sensitive to temperature. I mean, in essence, grilled salmon, blackened salmon, when you start to cook salmon at those types of temperatures and in that fashion, there's a massive loss and destruction or oxidation, to make it worse, of those fatty acids. And then with walnuts, it's the same. You toast or brown walnuts, at the temperatures required to do that, and you're going to lose a major component of those omega-3s. I'm really not in favor of significant heat processing. I think if you're going to, really look at the best way to cook salmon, it would be to poach that salmon, which is, I know some people say sous vide is the ultimate, which it's cooked in like a silicone pouch. I don't think that's always necessary, but poaching salmon, which is going to occur at 212 Fahrenheit or 100 degrees Celsius, that preserves most of those omega-3s. But when you start getting into the grilling temperatures, that you're going to have massive losses.
Okay. We went into this a little bit, Dr. Bagnulo, but talk a little bit more about, because there's this very big misconception, of the saturated fats, they raise LDL cholesterol and that sort of thing. And, should more people be getting like their NMR lipoprofile level checked, which is obviously going to show the LDL particle size? Like, what is your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's really well said. I mean, the best way to look at lipids is to look at them qualitatively as opposed to quantitatively. And historically, we have embarked on what we refer to as the lipid theory, and I think that's really important. All joking aside, I can't help myself. I have to laugh when I say it. So we've been operating off of this lipid theory now for several decades, which is cholesterol causes heart disease. More cholesterol means more heart disease, and that's just not the way that things have unfolded here. We have a much, much better understanding over the last 20 years or so, which is that it's the way cholesterol is packaged by the human body. Small, dense LDLs, to your point, really looking at a lipoprofile, getting an LDL pattern for a patient gives us a much clearer picture of how susceptible these cholesterol transport vesicles that we call LDLs, how susceptible are they to oxidation? I mean, oxidation and inflammation are what drive disease, every disease, whether that's a mitochondrial disease that leads to neurodegeneration, or that's cardiovascular disease that ultimately results in arterial plaque formation and the blockage there downstream that causes a myocardial infarction. Everything's revolving on oxidation and inflammation. And LDLs that are small and dense, they can't carry the fat-soluble vitamins from our whole vegetables and from things like that extra virgin olive oil or our coffee. I mean, all these fat-soluble antioxidants, they can be carried by LDLs, but the LDL has to be large enough and buoyant enough for it to serve as a transport vesicle. And when that happens, the LDL is protected against oxidation, which is a necessary step for ultimately the formation of heart disease. But the small dense LDLs are unprotected and they're easily oxidized. And that's the type of LDL molecule that is what we'd refer to as a bad lipid, a bad cholesterol. So knowing that is critical. And you know what we normally see, Laura, is that small dense LDLs, yeah, there's a genetic component to them for sure. But the other major association is higher levels of refined carbohydrates, higher levels of dietary sugar, higher levels of flour-based foods and all these high glycemic foods. That is the one component of lifestyle that is clearly linked to small, dense LDLs. But this is a separate conversation than total LDL, total cholesterol. Eating coconut oil, eating butter is not something that puts a person at greater risk for heart disease simply because it raises cholesterol or even raises LDL levels. What's important to know is what are the qualities of those LDLs.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that detailed explanation. Your personal thoughts on fish oil supplements? Do they have a role? If so, can you give some tips on good, like not necessarily naming brands, but like what should somebody be looking for in a fish oil supplement?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a great question. I don't have the kind of evidence that I wish I did. I don't have empirical evidence to say that fish oil is going to reduce all-cause mortality, give someone a healthier aging process, protect them against heart disease. I don't have that empirical evidence, so I tend to be really conservative in what I say about fish oil. I think that there may be a time and a place for it in a case where, let's just say, a patient has a very high level of omega-6 fatty acids to omega-3s in their red blood cell membrane. If we have evidence of that, and there's definitely an inflammatory based condition present, they won't eat oily fish or have some type of restriction where they can't access it or tolerate it. And let's just say they're a male, so we know that their conversion of omega-3s in the way of alpha-linolenic acid is markedly reduced compared to a woman's. That may be a case where the fish oil is one of the only options that we have available for that individual, but it's not ideal, that's for sure. I say that for a couple reasons. One is, there's a lot more to eating oily fish than just DHA and EPA. This has really been lost in the kind of conversation over the years. There's a type of, it's not an omega-3 fatty acid, but there's a type of fat that's actually a saturated fat. It almost always accompanies DHA and EPA in fish, and it's called heptadecanoic acid. It's 17 carbons long. That doesn't end up in your fish oil capsules, but maybe it should. That's really where I'm going with this. Anytime we take a food and we reduce that food to one nutrient, that reductionistic approach almost always, without fail, comes back to provide either a less nutritious, less advantageous, or in some cases, potentially harmful supplement. And I've seen this done with blueberries. I've seen this done with obviously beta carotene and other, and it's certainly going to be shown at some point to be the case with taking oily fish and trying to reduce the consumption of that food down to just EPA and DHA. When we lose all of those other fatty acids that occur, albeit in smaller quantities, but they still occur in oily fish, we are in essence losing the symphony. We're losing that orchestra that works together in a concerted fashion, in balance and synergy to produce, let's say, less inflammation and to have those omega-3s used appropriately by the body. And again, this heptadecanoic acid, the 17 carbon fat, is just one example of a fatty acid that does not end up in a fish oil capsule. So my long-winded answer to this, Laura, is that if someone does not eat oily fish and needs additional omega-3s in a kind of fully elongated, highly unsaturated form, i.e. something along the lines of DHA and EPA, I think they would do better with a krill oil supplement. I don't have any affiliations with any manufacturers of fish oil or krill oil, but krill oil can be found in a less processed, more of a whole type form, and you really want to get krill oil that has that deep red pigment known as astaxanthin, which would reflect its lower level minimal processing.
Great, thank you so much. And unfortunately, guys, it looks like we are out of time. I know I'm not trying to pick over people here, but we probably have like 30 questions we didn't get to. So you're not alone. If we didn't get to your question, I apologize. But like I said, I will hopefully put out a blog here in a few weeks to answer some of these additional questions because they're all really good. You should expect to get your continuing professional education certificate by the end of the day tomorrow. So they don't come out right after you take the survey, but I will send them out by the end of the day tomorrow. And as always, we appreciate your time and your attentiveness, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you, Dr. Bagnulo, for all of your knowledge. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, Laura. Take care.
You too.